Quite a while ago on TikTok, I made a video on how National Socialism is socialism and not capitalism. A few months later, I received a response. This was from a person I had previously blocked. I blocked him because he would make long-winded, gish-gallopy videos responding to my own videos, and I got tired of having to dig through pages and pages of sources just to make sure he was telling the truth. Often, he was not. This entire method he used really annoyed me, and I was just tired of dealing with it, so I blocked him. Before I blocked him, I did respond to one last video, which was the last video he made about me. But after I blocked him, he continued to make many videos about me, clout chasing, and doing his typical gish-gallopy and pseudo-intellectualism. When he made these videos about how I was wrong about Nazism, I initially didn't want to watch them. But after a long time of many people pressuring me about it, I decided to check it out. And it was no surprise to me that his videos once again were full of gish-galloping, pseudo-intellectualism, and outright lies. So today I will be responding to all three of these videos. We can go ahead and start with the first one.
Was the Nazi Party in Germany actually socialist? No, they were not.
This is definitely going to be unpopular, but yes, the National Socialists were social.
This is going to be a three-part response so that I can explain in detail why they weren't socialists. I'd like to preface this by saying that I'm a master's graduate with 2 degrees specialising in this, and Benjamin Politics is hopelessly out of his depth. I'll also call them Nat socks so that this stays up.
Well, of course we start off with the typical Marxist elitism. But you know what? That's okay. I don't need a degree or an entire university behind me. I can still beat someone because I know how to read and be honest. Also because history and reality is on my side.
A few things here would fit in with National Socialism.
The problem is that socialism is not when the government does stuff. This definition is oversimplified because it fails to state in whose interest the control is exercised.
So of course it's very important to start off with the definitions of words. In my initial video, I brought up the definition of socialism from the Merriam-Webster dictionary. This is not a bad definition of socialism. He dismisses this definition and offers no counter definition. This was not a mistake. If he offers a counter definition, then he has to actually defend it. Now going forward, it's easy to prove Nazis weren't socialist, since he didn't have to define what socialism is. He dismisses my definition because Nazism fits that definition several times over. If he offered his own definition, I could have done a few things to counteract it. I could have said his definition wasn't sufficient enough because maybe it didn't use actual experts, actual dictionaries, or actual consensus. Or I could have shown his own definition still fit in with Nazism. We see that this section is where he starts being intellectually dishonest, if I can even call it that. I prefer to call it intellectually gross, but even then it still might be giving him way too much credit to have the word intellectually in there. Now to continue on with definitions. What are socialism and capitalism? I'm going to look no further than Hans Hermann Hoppe's book, A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. In this work, Hoppe says, socialism by no means is an invention of 19th century Marxism, but much older. It must be conceptualized as an institutionalized interference with or aggression against private property and private property claims. Capitalism, on the other hand, is a social system based on the explicit recognition of private property and of non-aggressive contractual exchanges between private property owners. The more you think about it, the more these definitions make perfect sense and really should be accepted by everyone. These socialists may advocate for some sort of nationalization or collectivization. This is anti-private property. The capitalists want the means of production to be private property, and for these private means of production and factors of production to be exchanged in free trade. These definitions consistently fit in with most dictionary definitions as well. Hoppe continues, implied in this remark, as will become clear in the course of this treatise, is the belief that there must exist varying types and degrees of socialism and capitalism, i.e. varying degrees to which private property rights are respected or ignored. Societies are not simply capitalist or socialist. Indeed, all existing societies are socialist to some extent. Now, we fundamentally established that socialism and capitalism are about private property. One is for and one is against. With this in mind, we should see what the conception of private property by fascists was to determine if the fascists were socialist. We can look at Anthony James Gregor's work. Gregor was a political scientist and professor of political science at the University of California, Berkeley. In his book, The Ideology of Fascism, The Rationale of Totalitarianism, he says, "The fascist conception of property refused to countenance collective possession as such. Individual ownership rights were understood to be strictly subordinate to collective discipline. It was not the individual ownership of property that concerned fascist, but its subordination to collective control. Property was understood to perform social functions rather than to manifest individual rights. It was clear that the conception of property as a social function was broad enough to include the socialization of the means of production, should that be required by the national interests as interpreted by the state. With this conception of private property, we can see why Gregor would define fascism as socialism of the proletariat nations. So the fascist, including the Nazis, since they were fascist, would ideologically be socialist. In the book The Vampire Economy by Gunter Reimann, Reimann, who was a communist economist who lived under the Nazis, has an entire chapter titled Destruction of the Sanctity of Private Property. In this chapter, he states, "The owner of the property was helpless, since under fascism there is no longer an independent judiciary that protects the private property rights of private citizens against the state. The authoritarian state has made it a principle that private property is no longer sacred. The decree of February 28, 1933, nullified Article 153 of the Weimar Constitution, which guaranteed private property and restricted interference with private property in accordance with certain legally defined conditions. The conception of property has experienced a fundamental change. The individualistic conception of the state, a result of the liberal spirit, must give way to the concept that communal welfare precedes individual welfare."
The exact definition of fascism is kind of hard to pin down, but basically it's an ultra-conservative, hyper-nationalistic ideology that focuses on suppressing labor power at the behest of corporations and religion.
So the whole thing about labor power is absolutely fabricated. Like, you just made that up on the spot because that's just not true by any metric.
Actually, it's true by almost every metric. Strikes were illegal. During their rule, wages fell 11% while the top 10% got richer. The Nazis always sided with employers and gave them the right to forcibly increase hours, decline resignations, set workers' wages, and send disobedient workers to forced labour camps. Matt isn't making it up. He's absolutely right.
The reason for banning strikes wasn't because they were against the best interest of workers. It was because strikes were causing something that went against the unification of Germany. Another reason why the Nazis banned strikes was due to the belief that the state must guide the population. The Nazis held the position of everything within the state, nothing outside the state, everything in the state. So they did ban private unions and strikes. However, they did have public unions. In Nazi Germany, they had the Labor Front, also known as the DAF. There are actually two other famous socialists who banned private unions, Lenin and Thomas Sankara. Lenin also banned strikes, so I guess Lenin isn't a socialist now. No, strikes and private labor unions are just something that doesn't fit in within socialism. These things are meant to be socialist actions against capitalism. Once you've gotten rid of capitalism, they are no longer needed. The DAF, according to this guy, did nothing for workers, and the Nazis only served the employers. But this couldn't be further from the truth. We read in The History of Fascism by Stanley G. Payne. One of the most important new social organizations was the German Labor Front, or the DAF. Under its director, Robert Ley, the DAF quickly swelled to more than 6 million members, and by 1938 maintained a larger budget than the Nazi Party. The Law for the Ordering of German Labor of January 1943 created a structure of leaders and their workers in each factory, with courts of social honor for both. Though under strict hierarchical rule, the DAF did not ignore worker interest and often acted to improve conditions. Unlike the situation in fascist Italy, shop stewards did operate under the DAF. Though the first elections to councils of trust in factories produced few positive votes, they were never tried again. Ley hoped to build the Labor Front into a major autonomous force, even conceiving the ambition of having it replace the party as the basis of National Socialism, though such aims were soon squashed. So the DAF was a very large and important organization. Before getting into what the Labor Front did, we have to talk about who headed it. Dr. Robert Ley was a raging socialist and anti-Semite. Ley would become a prominent member of the party due to his support for the improvement of living standards in the working class, arguing against the capitalist mode of production multiple times. Lay would say things like, "Today the owner can no longer tell us, my factory is my private affair. This was before. That's over now. The people inside of it depend on his factory for their contentment, and these people belong to us. This is no longer a private affair, this is a public matter. And he must think and act accordingly and answer for it." Ray also believed that the state would have to force industrialists to cooperate with workers, saying, "I always say that the workers and managers belong together, and we will not leave you alone whether you want us to or not, whether you like it or not. If the manager says, 'It is ridiculous that I always have to participate in employee meetings, I won't do it,' we reply, 'You must do it. 10,000 workers are marching, the best German blood. It should be an honor for you to march at their head. If you do not want to do that, we will have to put you back into the ranks where the man behind you can tread on your heels until you do it properly. We will teach you, believe me, we will not give up." So instead of letting workers privately bargain with their employers, Lay and the Nazis believed that the state should force employers to cooperate with the workers, nationalizing unions, not banning them. Now we'll get back to the unions in just a second. I want to look at some of these specific claims made in his video and their citations.
During their rule, wages fell 11% while the top 10% got richer.
Now first, let's read his source. Wages as a percentage of national income fell by 11% between 1932 and 1938. Inequality actually increased between 1928, when the top 10% of earners took 37% of total national income, and 1936, when they took 39%. 37 to 39% really isn't that much of an increase, especially over such a large period of time. I'm wondering if there was actually an increase of the number of people in the top 10%. Regardless, this doesn't even matter. First, I will show you what the wages actually looked like in this time period, just so you have more context. Now I'm going to show you what wages looked like during Allende's rule in Chile. This wage drop is significantly larger than what happened in Germany, yet people wouldn't say Allende wasn't a socialist. This is actually another incredibly intellectually dishonest position to hold, that you cannot be a socialist if wages fall, or you cannot be a socialist if inequality increases. We can go over numerous historical examples of well-known socialists who this happened under. This really is not an argument, but let's continue.
The Nazis always sided with employers and gave them the right to forcibly increase hours.
This time it is a blatant lie. His exact citation says, in July 1934, trustees of labor were given the right to increase working time to more than the legal norm of 8 hours a day. So contrary to what he said, this was not the employers that were able to do this. This was the labor trustees in the labor union. And again, I can point to an example of well-known socialism where they did similar things, like the Soviet Union, where they had both minimum and maximum amounts of work hours, which were mandated by the state and state labor unions.
Decline resignation, set workers' wages, and send disobedient workers to forced labor camps.
Again, all of these powers were held by the labor unions and the state, not capitalists. And again, the Soviet Union did all of these things, as did many other socialist nations and socialist leaders.
In 1933, trade unions were abolished in Germany. This made it impossible for workers to negotiate better wages and improvements in their working conditions.
Unions were not abolished, private unions were abolished. And they had unions that were part of the state and part of the party. They still had unions, they still had workers' rights, and all of that stuff.
You're thinking of the Labour Front. It replaced unions but wasn't a union. The leader refused unequivocally to establish their own party trade unions. A union advocates for workers and negotiates wages. As soon as they took over in 1933, the Labour Front were told that they were not allowed a role in wage negotiation or workers' rights. All the power was in the hands of the employers. As historian Richard Evans put it, by 1934 it was clear that in the battle to control labour relations, employers had come out on top.
The DAF absolutely was a labor union, and yes, they did work on helping workers' rights and working conditions. In the biography of Adolf Hitler by John Toland, he says, "Working conditions were improved with more windows, less crowding, and better washrooms. Under the slogan, beautification in every place, all offices and workrooms were kept clean and neat. There were abundant flowers so those who labored could enjoy their surroundings. Such gains were not illusory. Never before had the worker enjoyed such privileges. The Strength Through Joy program, initiated by Robert Lay's Labor Front, provided subsidized concerts, theater performances, exhibitions, dances, films, and adult education courses for the workers. The most revolutionary project was subsidized tourism. The humblest laborer and his family could now travel aboard luxury liners for undreamed of holidays. And this claim that the state only served employers is wrong and completely backwards in reality. We read in the book Hitler Revolution by Richard Tedder. The record of court proceedings for 1939 demonstrates that the labor law primarily safeguarded the well-being of employees rather than their overseers. During that year, the courts conducted 14 hearings against workers and 153 against plant managers, assistant managers, and supervisors. In 7 cases, the directors lost their jobs. In Niall Ferguson's book, War of the World, it states that workers in Germany saw a rise in wages. The scale of the Nazi economic achievement should not be underestimated. It was real and impressive. No other European economy achieved such a rapid recovery. To most people in 1930s Germany, it seemed there had been an economic miracle. The national community was more than mere rhetoric. It meant full employment, higher wages, stable prices, reduced poverty, cheap radios, and budget holidays. We also read again in Hitler's Revolution, the wage law did not level off personal income regardless of occupation. Grading took such factors into consideration as physical or mental demands of a job, the precision or independent initiative required, education, hazards, and experience. Its purpose was to establish a system that could be applied to the most diverse careers and activities and help reduce social and economic differences. It acknowledged the value of honest labor and the need to adequately compensate all who perform it. A guiding principle of the wage grading program was not to reduce the standard of living of previously higher paid associates, but to elevate that of those who earned less. This arrangement sliced into the profits of industry. By 1938, the cost to employers for workers' salaries had risen another 6.5%. They included paid holidays for labor, a measure Hitler personally introduced. The wage law established a minimum monthly income per person, sufficient to guarantee a decent living standard. It affected 96% of all salaries nationwide. The Führer himself wrote that bringing a particular class of people into the community, quote, does not succeed by dragging down the upper classes, but by elevating the lower. This process can never be carried out by the higher class, but by the lower fighting for its equal rights.
The Nazis utilized privatization so much that the term was invented to describe the practice that the Nazis engaged in.
Now, the whole claim that they privatized stuff is very misleading. They privatized several things because they deemed them as having too much Jewish influence.
Well, no, the privatization was actually about war, like most of the Nazi economy. Selling public assets funded rearmament and increased ties with arms companies. Nazi economics was all about war.
The idea that the Nazi economy was just military-orientated is absurd. Look at the military spending. I'm sure it had more military spending due to it having to rebuild its military completely, but the idea that it was just a military economy is false. To quote the book Hitler's Revolution again, during 1933 and 1934, the Reich devoted less than 4% of the budget to defense. This was not even half the percentage spent by France, Japan, and the USSR, which already maintained large arsenals. And of course, the USSR was socialist. Germany was in a position to implement a massive rearmament program had Hitler wanted it by 1936. Factories were operating at nearly full capacity. The Reich possessed a modern, efficient machine tool industry. The US and Germany controlled 70% of the international export market of this commodity, with a minimal corresponding import. In fact, 1938 Germany had 1.3 million machine tools in industry, twice the number of England's. This circumstance, however, proved of little value to Germany's armed forces because Hitler did not assign priority to the manufacture of military hardware. The Nazi economy didn't become an actual military economy until 1944, when Albert Speer started to oversee that economy in mid-1943. Also, there were tons of public works and welfare initiatives that had to do with just economic recovery and reducing unemployment and had nothing to do with war. To quote once again the book Hitler's Revolution, industry in Germany focused on housing construction, improving working conditions for labor, public works, consumer goods, and KDF automobile and shipbuilding programs. These projects consumed large quantities of materials such as metals, rubbers, and timber, and employed a significant percentage of skilled labor. Qualified tradesmen, engineers, and technicians were unavailable for the arms industry. One German historian concluded, "In the 6.5 years until the outbreak of war, the German economy achieved enormous success, but the result of these huge endeavors remained relatively small for the armed forces. The economy of Nazi Germany relied on selling off failed industries, switching the currency standard to labor, closing off trade markets, public works, tax cuts, and investments into both agriculture and manufacturing, not war."
I think many leftists would agree with several of the 25 points of the National Socialist Workers' Party, such as number 11 and number 13, and especially number 14, that's socialism.
So this program was made a full 13 years before they took power and before H even became leader. Like their name, it was intended to entice socialists, and historians are agreed that most early Nazi literature didn't reflect their beliefs. They went on to privatize the trusts and banks that they're pledging to nationalize here.
Oh, hold on there, buddy. How do you privatize something that you pledged to nationalize? I mean, if you pledged to nationalize it, that implies it was already privatized. So how do you further privatize it? You can't. This is just made up. It's true that the banks were not nationalized, but the reason was there was frankly no reason to nationalize them. The banks under Nazi Germany had no effect on the state and were less powerful than they had ever been. We read in Wages of Destruction by Adam Tooze, "The great banks of Berlin were thus saved from nationalization. The evidence suggests, however, that they were never really recovered from the damage done to them by the financial crisis of 1931. In purely commercial terms, the Berlin great banks were amongst the chief losers of the Nazi economic recovery. Between 1932 and 1939, in which period German output more than doubled, the total assets of the Berlin great banks rose by only 15%. By contrast, the assets of the savings bank, the main vehicle for what one might call popular liquidity, rose by 102% over the same period. At the same time, the international business of the great banks was sharply curtailed by the collapse in Germany's foreign trade. Contrary to the view that great banks were the ultimate string pullers of National Socialism, it is in fact hard to think of any other period in modern German history in which these institutions had less influence than the period between 1933 and 1945.
One piece of evidence that the Nazis were not socialist is the fact that the concentration camps were built for political prisoners.
This is kind of ridiculous because Matt has also called places like Cuba and the Soviet Union socialist, and they have taken political prisoners, and especially in the Soviet Union on a very, very large scale. There's nothing in socialism that says you can't take political prisoners.
Point is who those prisoners were. Most of the camps were used to imprison trade unionists and leftists in 1933 and 34 when they first took power.
Ah yes, because the Soviets totally never did anything against social democrats, anarchists, or other wings of Marxists or socialists that disagreed with them. Absolutely, man. And the Cubans never imprisoned gay people or anything like that. They were all super ultra progressive dictatorships. This is just more intellectual dishonesty. My refutation was more than sufficient on this point.
Finally, lots of libertarians have accused me of lying about this subject, but the truth is that I studied this for my master's degree.
Oh yeah, because studying something for a master's degree means you will never lie about it, and you are always correct about it. Okay, yeah, alright. I've already proven that he is a liar on this subject, so let's continue.
I'm citing the top historians on the Nazoc's history while Benjamin Politics is clutching a book republished by the Mises Institute. I can't emphasize enough how irrelevant it is.
The first time I saw this, I was actually shocked that he decided to be this intellectually dishonest. He just tried to discredit a book because it was republished by an academic institution. Wow. He cites only 2 historians on the subject and says they have the final word. While these guys may be experts on Nazi history, they are not experts on economics, and they absolutely do not have the final say in whether or not the Nazis were socialist. And I will show you why in just a moment. The Vampire Economy was written in 1939. This was before the Mises Institute even existed. Gunter Reimann was an economist. He was not only an economist, he was a communist economist. He was not biased in any way to capitalists or libertarians. And to say this book is irrelevant, this book about doing business under fascism is irrelevant to business under fascism, is just pure lying. This is an absolutely fantastic book you should absolutely pick up. Ignore people like Antifa who want to push you into only reading people who agree with them, and who say you should listen to him because he's studying for a master's degree, but you shouldn't listen to an economist who lived under the Nazi regime.
Two of those historians, who I'd encourage you to read, have spoken on this directly and stated it as plain as day. The Natsocks were not socialists.
So yeah, all he has is an appeal to authority. These guys are experts on Nazi history, therefore whatever they say is true. Now, of course, Richard Evans is a great historian, but let me show you why you should not listen to this quote that people often use to prove the Nazis weren't socialist. I will read the entire quote to you instead of selectively editing it. Despite the change of name, however, it would be wrong to see Nazism as a form of, or outgrowth from, socialism. True, as some have pointed out, its rhetoric was frequently egalitarian. It stressed the need to put the common needs above the needs of the individual, and it often declared itself as opposed to big business and international finance capital. Famously, too, anti-Semitism was once declared to be the socialism of fools. But from the very beginning, Hitler declared himself implacably opposed to social democracy, and initially, to a much smaller extent, communism. After all, the November traitors who had signed the Armistice and later the Treaty of Versailles were not communist at all, but the Social Democrats and their allies. So, what Mr. Evans is saying here is he thinks socialists are either social democrats or communist. Social democrats are not the same type of socialist. They are much more mild socialists who are still much more capitalist leaning, and communists are Marxist, who are striving for a stateless, classless, moneyless society as predicted by Karl Marx. As we established in the beginning, socialism did not originate from Marx. Evans does not know what he is talking about when it comes to economics and socialism. Sure, he is a great historian, but clearly I have demonstrated he is wrong. Going back to Hans Hermann Hoppe's A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism, he says, "Indeed, fascism's and Nazism's most fervently abhorred enemy was not socialism as such, but liberalism. Of course, both also despise the socialism of the Marxists and the Bolshevists, because at least ideologically they were internationalists and pacifists, while fascism and Nazism were nationalist movements devoted to war and conquest." In Ludwig von Mises's book, Omnipotent Government, which is a critique of fascism, he points out that many progressives today try to substitute socialism for capitalism when it comes to the Nazis. He says, "The distinctive mark of Nazism is not socialism or totalitarianism or nationalism. In all nations today, the progressives are eager to substitute socialism for capitalism. While fighting the German aggressors, Great Britain and the United States are step-by-step adopting the German pattern of socialism." Economist George Reisman says in his essay, Why Nazism Was Socialism and Why Socialism is Totalitarian, what Mises identified was that private ownership of the means of production existed in name only under the Nazis, and that the actual substance of ownership of the means of production resided in the German government. For it was the German government, and not the nominal private owners, that exercised all of the substantive powers of ownership. It, not the nominal private owners, decided what was to be produced, in what quantity, by what methods, and whom it was to be distributed, as well as what prices would be charged, and what wages would be paid, and what dividends or other income nominal private owners would be permitted to receive. The position of the alleged private owners, Mises shows, was reduced essentially to that of government pensioners. De facto government ownership of the means of production, as Mises termed it, was logically implied by such fundamental collectivist principles embraced by the Nazis as that the common good comes before the private good, and the individual exists as a means to the ends of the state. Now, I think I've sufficiently proven that Nazism is socialism, and the guy in the original video is absolutely wrong. Thank you everyone for watching this video, and thank you for Seth helping out with the research. If you guys have any particular videos you'd like me to make, or things you want me to respond to, please let me know in the comments and I will try to read them. And obviously this shouldn't need to be said, but I will go ahead and add a disclaimer here. I do not agree with the economic policies of the Nazis. I am still an anarcho-capitalist. I believe in what Hans Hermann Hoppe presents in A Theory of Socialism and Capitalism. A capitalist system would have been far more beneficial for Germany. And just because I point out some positives that happened in Germany does not mean it was a good system. The negatives and other factors far outweigh the positives that happened.